Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. Before I dive into the topic, I want to give a big shout out to the Productized team. They've overcome all of the obstacles in 2020 and put together an amazing event for us. Thank you so much for that. Also, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really excited about this opportunity. I'm Karolina. I'm a senior design researcher at Frog Design Munich, and I want to share a few thoughts on writing the data privacy wave and leave you with 5 tips to apply a data privacy lens to your research ops. So basically, you can say this is a talk involving laws and surfing. And at this point, I have to make my little disclaimer because I'm not a lawyer, but I'm also not a surfer. So why would I talk about data privacy then? And the reason for that is because we see a lot of interesting things happening in this space at the moment. So first of all, the power of data is becoming a central theme. So for example, the Netflix documentary Social Dilemma really revolves around how you can use user data as a company and really manipulate users' decisions and ultimately their behavior. Secondly, privacy is becoming a unique selling point. So there's a lot of alternatives to traditional social media popping up at the moment. And they all have one thing in common, which is that they promise to have a better focus on data privacy. So just to give you a few examples, we have DuckDuckGo as a browser, we have Telegram as a messaging app, and we have ProtonMail as an email program. And last but not least, legislation is shifting in favor of the consumer. That's all of us. Laws like GDPR in Europe or CCPA in California are not just meant to be a nuisance to us professionals, but what they want to do really is to give control over data back to us. What's brand new is the right to be forgotten and the right to have, for example, access to the data a company has about you. There's more, but these are just a few examples. What you see in the little image on the top right is actually my Google dashboard, and this would be my starting place to get a copy of the data Google has about me, and also the starting place where I could request the deletion. Okay, that explains why data privacy. Why surfing then? And to this, I'm going to tell you a little story. Like one day I was going out to do a new round of research. I was really excited about the topic and the questions I want to ask, and I was looking forward to, generating some great insights. But then GDPR got me like this. It really hit me like a big wave, and it challenged so much of the routines I had established for myself as a design researcher. And now if you look at data privacy and surfing together, there's a few differences and commonalities I want to highlight now. So let's start with the difference. And there's only one I can come up with. And the difference is in the people they involve. So data privacy mostly deals with lawyers, whereas surfing mostly deals with cool dudes. Now let's switch to the things they have in common. First, they have the internet in common. So you can serve the internet, obviously, but also data privacy is becoming more and more of a topic when thinking about data and the internet, with new ways of storing data, new ways of sharing data, new ways of using data to manipulate people. And the last thing I want to highlight here is another commonality, which is they're both very hard to learn. So while GDPR with its 30,000 words or so is really hard to wrap your head around, also until this day, I haven't managed to really ride a wave gracefully, and I don't think I ever will be able to do so. So both being hard to learn. How do you learn how to ride the data privacy wave? And to start this conversation, I want to introduce my 5 pillars for data privacy and design research. The first being stakeholders. So who are the people that have an interest in what I'm doing as a researcher? What are processes that are in place or need to be in place in order to make research happen? What are tools and templates I'm using, and what are tools and templates I want to design in the future? How can we drive behavior change? Because now that we introduce new processes and potentially new tools and templates, how do we ensure that people are actually picking up on it? And finally, how do we make sure that we're still telling compelling and engaging stories about our findings? The good news is that common service design methods apply. So you can use a lot that's already in your service design toolkit and apply them to these 5 pillars. And as a bonus, when you start tackling them, you will naturally end up with improved research operations. And research operation is defined as this by the ResearchOps community. ResearchOps is the people, mechanisms, and strategies that set user research in motion. It provides the roles, tools, and processes needed to support researchers in delivering and scaling the impact of the craft across an organization. And that's actually a lot of the things I'm going to touch upon in this talk. It's less about the act of doing research itself, but it's more about the things that are supporting a good research practice. Let's start with the first pillar. Let's have a look at stakeholders. I would argue that research stakeholders are a really diverse bunch. And the most important one to mention at the beginning is the participant themselves. Because ultimately they have control over the data and they need to be on board with everything you do with their data. If you look at your organization internally, of course, you have the researcher, the research team. You also have the design team that is using your research input. You have project managers that try to keep everyone on the project happy and try to not overwhelm them with crazy processes. You have the legal team and IT that act more like enablers to make sure that everything can run and is okay to do. You have marketing and business development that might be interested in, or that are definitely interested in telling stories about the work you do to the outside world. The outside world, like external to your organization, there's also stakeholders in research. So we have recruiting agencies that we, work with to find suitable research participants. We have our clients, if you work in an agency setting, that are interested in, what you're actually coming up with through this research. We have data privacy experts that have a keen interest in you adhering to the rules of the game. You have contractors on the team that you might need to be onboarding to your data privacy practice. And then you have publicly facing things like conferences, publications, or your company website where you want to showcase the work. To start navigating all of this and managing all of those different needs and expectations, you really need to collaborate. And I recommend to work in a multidisciplinary team. So don't think data privacy is your sole and only responsibility. You really need to think about how to set up a good team to tackle this from, a holistic perspective. And I'm going to share what I think is a really good team to start setting up a research practice for data privacy. Obviously, I would start with the research team, getting some people on board from the research team, because they worry about how they can collect and use research data to provide valuable insights. Then it makes sense to involve the designers because they want to continue leveraging your research to drive design decisions in the implementation and development phase. Then it makes sense to involve project management because they are mostly worried about how they can keep teams, clients, and other stakeholders happy, ensuring that they're not overwhelming the team and the client with too much processes and too much bothersome tasks. Then let's involve IT, because they will need to help us set up an infrastructure from an IT perspective that contributes to all of holistic data privacy practice. And last but not least, we should involve legal we should involve legal early on in order to have them design the legal framework to make all of those happen. And then you really need to get a detailed understanding of how you work, how you store data, how you use data in a report, and so forth. Sometimes you want to go even beyond this core team that I just showed, and maybe you want to also talk to recruiters or clients or other external stakeholders to get their feedback on what they are expecting out of your research, and especially with respect to data privacy. So you can conduct stakeholder interviews or co-working session with them. You can also do that with your core team if, for example, legal is not available for you 27. But co-working sessions have been proving very successful in my experience when working with legal, especially. So we've collaborated on tools and templates together as a team. So when you're putting together, the starting points for your data privacy practice, really think about who is your A team. Let's have a look at pillar number 2, processes. Interactions relevant for data privacy might be, or some of them might be more obvious, like, using a consent form, and then taking videos and photos, and then at some point deleting the data. But those might also be hiding in places where you don't necessarily expect them. So personal data, which is all that data privacy regulations revolve around, might be living in interview calendar invites. So you might have mentioned the participant's full name and their address in order to make the team meet at their house when you're doing in-home interviews. Or when you type notes, you might be recording different data points, and if you combine them, you might be actually identifying a person. In team internal communication, you might accidentally, share a photo on Slack, and then now suddenly this photo of the participant also lives on Slack. Data storage also becomes an issue now, because now that we work in the EU, we can simply store participant data in the US without having participant consent to that. So to start wrapping your head around this, I would really recommend to map this to really get a holistic understanding of what's going on. So we've been starting with this process by listing all of the people, places, tools, interactions, templates, and whatnot, in order to, get an understanding of what is relevant for data privacy. Once we had that list, this was a great place to start tying everything together in a research service design blueprint. And I would really recommend when you're mapping your current process to map it from the participant's perspective, because ultimately they are the ones driving this journey. They decide which data you can collect, and they, in the end, also are the ones deciding when you are to delete the data. On the front stage, you put all of the interactions that you have directly with the participant, starting from sending an invite to confirm the interview, or even the most obvious one where you have the actual interview and you request data from them. In the backstage, this is everything in the project team that you do to set up your research. You synthesize the data, and you share findings with your stakeholders. Then behind the line of internal interaction, you have some support processes. And here I would expect mostly, how legal or IT can support all of your interactions with, internally, but also with the participant. Once you have mapped what you're currently doing, you can start challenging what you have. And good things to challenge what you have with are scenarios where participants exercise their rights. And I want to show you a few scenarios that I directly took from the GDPR, where they list the rights of the data subject. So I'm not claiming to make a complete list, but I just want to give you a few examples so you get a flavor of what those scenarios could be. So let's start. What if your research participant asks for information about why and how the data is processed? What if they ask for correction or completion of the data? So what if they have said something they're now embarrassed about and they want to, undo that? What if they ask for a copy of their data in a machine-readable format? How are you going to pull this off? And what if your research participant asks for permanent erasure of the data? So when they want to exercise their right to be forgotten. So and when you do that, you'll notice that there's lots of pain points and questions coming up at the beginning of this exercise. And you soon might be feeling like this, for example, when you realize your database is not really set up in a way that you can exercise a participant's right to be forgotten, or without having a lot of extra work and a lot of additional burden. So we'll get to how to solve that in a bit. So pillar number 3, tools and templates. So in order to solve those pain points, start scrutinizing existing tools and templates. So I'm going to show you a few pain points and how we address them by tweaking tools we already had. So one pain point we came across is educating participants on what will happen with their data and what their rights are. So with GDPR, we now need to get informed consent, which means that participants need to be aware and understand what they're signing. And in order to deliver this, we've been looking at our data consent forms and privacy policy and making sure we're using understandable language, as well as a structure that is easy to follow. Additionally, we've also updated our discussion guide template to include a little paragraph that the research team can use to educate participants in person. Then we found a pain point that anyone needs to be able to find raw data within a project folder. And before, people could design the project folders in more creative ways, let's say that. But we saw the need to really make sure that the research folder is structured in a consistent way so that anybody knows where they can find the raw data. Also, we needed to ensure that teams can continue to use the software they need. So we had a look at all our partnerships and had a look at whether the agreement was GDPR or data privacy compliant, or if we need to update our data consent forms accordingly, so we can use for example this tool to synthesize our research data. For some pain points, we needed to come up with new things because we didn't have existing tools that we could simply tweak. So for the pain point to trace all instances where participants' data was used, we came up with the data tracker. And this is basically a list where we record every instance where participants' data has been used. So for example, if we put a participant's face in a client presentation, we will take note of that and link to the file so we can retrieve that later when the participant is asking for deletion, for example. Also, another pain point was to decide what's the best setup when working with external stakeholders. So what we really like to do is we bring clients into the field to observe interviews, help us out with note-taking, and sometimes we even want to share with them the raw data so they can do their own, draw their own conclusions from it. Also, that might be the case when you're working in a global organization and you're working, for example, out of the Germany office, but now you want to share and invite people to join the project from the US, for example. So you also need to think about how you can make that happen from a data privacy perspective. So we came up with this decision aid that basically breaks it down in 6 possible scenarios and really helps everyone to navigate this a little bit easier. And then the last pain point I wanted to mention here is that sometimes, depending on the constellation you pick with your external stakeholders, you need to anonymize hundreds of photos after field work. So To this end, a design technologist in the Munich office came up with this amazing face blur tool, which allows you to batch process photos. It will automatically detect faces, and then you can just download the whole batch again, which is a great improvement compared to Photoshop opening an image, selecting the face, saving the document after having blurred and so forth. So this is a really big improvement for to be a little bit more efficient and save some time. Having designed now a version for all of those new tools and templates, this is not the end. As even ISO points out, iteration is the norm in design. So in order to come up with a design solution that meets user requirements, you need to probably circle a few times between designing solutions and testing them until they really work. So what we need to do here is that even GDPR seems to be or data privacy in general seems to be something that is rather rigid. Even here, we need to keep learning and keep improving what we have and how we work. So let's build prototypes and test them. The data tracker that I shared with you earlier, now what you've seen is version 4. And we've been, building the first version. We've shared it with some project teams that have, tested it, and we gathered feedback on it. And over time, we have improved the overall structure, then the wording to make it easier to navigate. And last but not least, we have updated the instructions of use. And I'm sure that another version will come out soon, but we'll see what improvements are to be made still. Another good thing to do is to keep track of the questions and pain points people bring up to you. So I've been receiving lots of questions via email and Slack and additional, maybe in person. What I've been doing is, of course, I responded to all of those questions and helped out. But what I did is I also took note of that this question has been asked in an Excel spreadsheet. So over time, I get a really good picture of what people's pain points and questions are. And so I'm using this to understand whether I need to improve a tool or template, or whether I need to update my training materials, or whether I need to add a little paragraph to the FAQ, which you can see on the right-hand side. So the FAQ is based on also this Excel spreadsheet. And whenever I come up with a pattern that is being asked frequently, I will also add a little note on the FAQ. So all of this is that you're not launching a finished and polished tool and template to the entire team before having questions whether you're going after the right direction and the right execution. Let's have a look at pillar number 4, behavior change. Behavior change is hard. It's probably one of the hard, or if not even the most hardest thing to design for as a designer. And there's multiple theories on why this is so hard. And I want to share the theory from Elliot T. Bergman with you from the University of Oregon. And he states it's because it consists of 2 components, one of which is the will to behavior change. So this is the motivational and emotional aspects to behavior change. This is the why should I change my behavior. This needs to be happening in tandem with having a way, like dealing with all of the cognitive and informational aspects of behavior change. So an individual needs to know how they can change their behavior in order to be successful with it. In the data privacy context, in a professional setup, I would say that the will is not the issue, because governments make sure that it's actually more of a must. And also, I haven't met a single professional that doesn't want to do right by their research participants and really want to make sure that everything is compliant with their rights. So yeah, the tricky part is going to be the way, like how can we make sure people know what they can do to change their behavior? And I would argue that we need to make whatever we set up in our data privacy practice, we need to make sure it's user-friendly. And one aspect to this is to reduce complexity. It's a very complex space with lots of room for interpretation. And what we've been doing is to limit options. So whereas it's nice if you have room to be creative, this is probably not the space where you want to have people to become too creative. So we've narrowed down to one place for question and answers. We have a Slack channel for that. We have 2 versions of deliverables. So we will create a show version that can show non-anonymized data when we share in person with our stakeholders. And then we will create a share version with all blurred faces, all personal data taken out to be circled around afterwards. We only have one folder structure for a user research folder. We narrowed down to 6 scenarios for involving external stakeholders, and we only have one way to share raw data within the team, which is a link to the actual file on our server, rather than to share the actual file through various channels. Also, we've defined a single source of truth, which might as well live on the previous slide, but I think this one is important to point out because, with I see this data privacy landscape ever changing. So I don't think we're near to be done with this, as those existing laws might be updated or other countries might be catching up. So what we have in terms of tools and processes might need to be adjusted over time. So in order to make sure that everyone always has the latest version, we created this one source of truth so that people don't have to share versions via email or other channels and still wondering whether that's the latest version for the consent form, for example. So on this site, you can actually access all of the documents that are relevant for design research and data privacy, starting with the consent forms, the data tracker templates, or the face blur tool. One thing I'd like to mention is still under the idea of user friendliness, that it might not be super obvious, but I think this is really important to train our teams and train our colleagues to help themselves and each other. So we shouldn't leave them with a 200-page report or a guideline on how to apply data privacy to them, data privacy to their day-to-day work, but really help them, give them hands-on experience, and basically not leave them alone and make sure that we're responding to all of the questions and concerns they have. So even though we're dealing with something like data privacy, I still believe that even in this space, there's something like a perfect user experience. Let's have a look at pillar number 5, storytelling. One of the basic principles we've been trying to set up, or we have set up, is to help others to avoid accidental spreading of personal data. And we're doing this by only using the raw data, the non-anonymized data within the project team. And everything that goes beyond, even with our colleagues in the extended team, we will only share anonymized data. That means, however, that we can't just simply design our reports or shareouts in the way that we are used to, because we've showed a lot of faces to make it human, but now there's more pixels than actual faces. So getting the human element into the shareout might be tough because you don't really see what are the facial expressions. Are they happy? Are they annoyed? Or what's going on even in this picture? And on top of that, it always looks more like burglars in a news report than, participants sharing their stories about your product. So what we need to do here is really to be creative. And I believe that as designers, we're most creative when we have lots of constraints, which is the case here. So what we can do, even when being in the field, when we're trying to document interviews, we can just start taking more different kinds of pictures rather than always clicking pictures of the person's face. So we can start taking more pictures of hands. And that works especially well when we're documenting processes, and just having the hands in there adds a really nice human element. You can also take photos from behind, especially when the participant is showing you something or looking at something, and just taking photos from behind is a great way to show people in your photos without revealing their identity. You can also take more contextual photos. So snap a couple of pictures of the desk or the living room, if that's okay for participants. And that's great because documenting objects really can tell a lot about cultures, personal preferences, and even their status. You can also have people out of focus in the background as long as you can recognize them. There's a few additional means you can leverage for storytelling in your presentations. One of them could be illustrations. So if you feel like you really need to depict certain features of a person, or you want to show their general appearance, you can use illustrations. You can also play around with a combination of photos and illustrated elements. Also, you can use participant-generated content. We typically use quite a bit of co-creation activities or homework exercises with our participants. And we can also use them to illustrate an individual's personal experience or point of view on a subject. And whenever we design those activities now, we have already in mind how we're going to use them in the share-outs later on. The last thing here is, you can also use substitute photography to tell a story. And this is especially useful for marketing, for example, or when you use it publicly. Because there you need really high quality content, and there you can use stock photography or even reenact scenes with actors to tell your story. Then one last thing here is that, there's AI, artificial intelligence, that can generate new realistic but fake faces. And you can use other AI to swap them with your participant's face, for example. So this could be a potential solution to play around with as well. And whatever you do, only haters say it's Photoshop. So these were my 5 pillars and 5 tips for data privacy and design research. And I want to quickly summarize them at the end now. We need to collaborate to include stakeholders. We need to map it to analyze processes. We need to keep learning to improve tools and templates. We need to make it user-friendly to facilitate behavior change. And we need to be creative to excel at storytelling. And if you start tackling those 5 pillars, you will go from this initial feeling of being overwhelmed to gaining more and more confidence in the subject. And finally, you'll be upholding privacy standards like a boss. Thank you. I really hope this talk was helpful to you and you learned a thing or two. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. I'm looking forward to it. I'm also looking forward to the fireside chat later, and I hope to see you all there. Bye.